The Metal Gear franchise is one of the most beloved and acclaimed in gaming. Aside from a few subpar non-canon titles, and some more recent entries which have missed the mark entirely, Konami's crown jewel was known for producing consistently great games throughout its storied 30-year history. The brainchild of Hideo Kojima, the Japanese director, writer, and producer, who created the series with an emphasis on avoiding conflict through evasion, which spawned the stealth genre and went on to influence dozens of other games throughout the years. And although many of these imitators, such as the Splinter Cell and Hitman series, were themselves responsible for many quality releases throughout the years, Metal Gear always managed to stay ahead of the competition through gameplay innovation and boundary-pushing visual and sound design, making each new entry in the series look, sound, and feel ahead of its time. Something else that distinguished Metal Gear in the medium was its story, containing one of the deepest, most complicated, and, at times, convoluted plots in all of gaming. Its sprawling narrative stretches over half a century in an alternative timeline, mirroring real life in many ways, while also blurring the line between fact and fiction. Baffling to casual gamers and difficult at times to grasp even for the most devoted Metal Gear fans, it is nonetheless one of its biggest strengths, adored by series faithfuls and unmatched by most gamers for depth and lore. Also, on a side note, I'm only ranking canon games in the series, meaning that spin-offs such as the Acid games will not feature on this list. So, with that said, and without further ado, here are the Metal Gear games ranked from worst to best. Number 10. Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. Released on the PSP in 2006, Portable Ops will always be credited as Metal Gear's first proper three-dimensional foray on handheld consoles, complete with voice acting, graphics which were frankly impressive for the console, and gameplay inspired by other main entries in the series, most notably Snake Eater. It would also introduce the mechanic of capturing enemy combatants as recruits for Snake's own private militia, a feature that would be pivotal in later games in the series. However, in spite of its technical impressiveness, the overall experience was hampered by some issues which would ultimately detract from the quality of the game as a whole. The story, while far from terrible, is one of the most forgettable in the series, evidenced by the fact that it was barely referenced in subsequent entries. Its plot just doesn't hold up to the series' high standards, and most of the new characters that are introduced, such as the main antagonist Gene, fail to make any lasting impact on the player the way other characters historically have. Gameplay-wise, Portable Ops can, unfortunately, be downright boring at times, with the developers seemingly finding it difficult to navigate the PSP's limited button scheme. They would rectify this issue almost completely on their next handheld release, more on which later, but for this game they seem to struggle replicating the authentic Metal Gear experience. And while technically it was impressive for the time, graphically its colour palette is dull and its environments are uninspired. On a more positive note, the voice acting and soundtrack are both excellent, but unfortunately that doesn't prevent it from coming dead last on this list. Number 9. Metal Gear. Released all the way back in 1987 on the MSX2 console, Metal Gear was the first game in this landmark series, introducing the world to the stealth action genre. Sent into the Fortress of Outer Heaven, heavily outgunned and outnumbered, players had to adapt to the concept of evasion. Metal Gear introduced us to some of the series' most important and iconic characters, most notably Big Boss and protagonist Solid Snake. Add to this the aforementioned sneak 'em up gameplay, basic but iconic score, a host of familiar weapons, and an emphasis on story, and you have the blueprint for what the series would ultimately become. Number 8. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, and Ground Zeroes. Simultaneously the most disappointing and technically impressive entry on this list, Metal Gear Solid 5, and yes, we're including the epilogue Ground Zeroes here, was released to critical acclaim, receiving numerous perfect scores and Game of the Year awards. And while critics lauded over the most recent canon entry in the series, fans were left beyond frustrated at the lack of narrative focus on display here, among many other problems. Remember how I mentioned at the start of the video that story was arguably the most vital part of any Metal Gear game? Well, Metal Gear Solid 5 is a cautionary example of what happens when an installment fails miserably in the plot department. Never mind lacking an engaging story, Metal Gear Solid 5 lacks even a cohesive one. New characters are hollow and boring, returning characters reprise their roles in pointless ways, and the overall story, without delving too deeply into spoiler territory, is uninspired and glaringly unfinished, with a rush ending and missing third act, all of which were a result of Kojima parting ways with the developer before the project's end. Which is a shame, because Metal Gear Solid 5 contains some of the most inspired gameplay mechanics not only seen in the series, but in all of gaming as a whole. Players are afforded an unprecedented amount of freedom, with missions that can be tackled in a variety of different ways, with minimal guidance from the game itself as to how to proceed. Add to this a dizzyingly in-depth weapon accumulation and customization, and a soldier recruitment and mother-based building tool that's expanded exponentially from Portable Ops and Peace Walker. But even still, with repetitive mission structures, repetitive environments, and no boss battles really to speak of, the mechanics cannot ultimately save MGS5 from being the monotonous mess it ultimately ends up becoming. For series casuals and those who could care less about story or pacing, Metal Gear Solid 5 is an exceptional sandbox of experimentation and exploration. But for genuine fans of the series, however, it will go down as one of the biggest missed opportunities in gaming, period. Number 7. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. A complete departure from the stealth action formula, Metal Gear Rising replaced sneaking and close quarters hand-to-hand combat with blistering hack-and-slash gameplay more reminiscent of God of War than Metal Gear Solid. The game continues the story of Raiden from Metal Gear Solid 4, a character who'd redeemed himself in the eyes of the haters, who felt his inclusion in Metal Gear Solid 2 was less than welcome. In Revengeance, Raiden uses his newly acquired ninja skills to tackle a private military company, or PMC, a theme which was very prevalent in Metal Gear Solid 4 also. The story, while lacking the depth of previous entries, was serviceable, satisfying series devotees, although many criticised the game's length, clocking in way short of other entries in the franchise. Gameplay, although completely different from the usual Metal Gear fare, was executed very well. The hack and slash action was fast paced and fluid, and a few camera issues aside, felt smooth. Given special praise was the precision cutting mechanic, which allowed Raiden to hack away specific parts of enemy combatants in slow motion, something completely unique to Rising. The boss fights too were praised, offering something totally different from what players of Metal Gear titles are usually accustomed to, which were nonetheless a hell of a lot of fun to play through. The die-hard fans also let out a sigh of relief when they discovered that stealth gameplay was not completely abandoned, as Raiden can navigate through parts of the game undetected should the player choose to do so. However, given the nature of the game, it is usually more intuitive to approach most situations head-on. The sound design was also given praise, with the soundtrack being a particular highlight, offering up some of the best tracks in the series. Graphically, Rising was predictably stunning, taking the lead from Metal Gear Solid 4, which wowed the gaming public upon release. Overall, Rising is a fun action game worthy of the Metal Gear moniker. Number 6. Metal Gear Solid: Peace Walker. Building on the solid but uninspired foundation laid by Portable Ops, Kojima's follow-up to that title on Sony's first handheld console wasn't just better than its predecessor, it improved upon it in every conceivable way. With a playstyle more akin to MGS3 or 4 than the rigid Portable Ops, combat was expanded upon, and the arsenal of weapons at your disposal was also far greater. The soldier capturing mechanic, set in place in Portable Ops, is also streamlined here, thanks to the full-time balloon system, which allows you to capture an enemy right after incapacitating them, rather than dragging them to a truck like you were forced to do in Portable Ops. The Mother Base Builder, which saw its debut here, gave the player a much greater incentive to capture new soldiers, as a deeper and more skilled militia group is pivotal to running the base effectively, while also giving you a greater roster of playable characters. Co-op multiplayer was also added, which was a blast, and the team even built certain missions and boss fights with cooperative play in mind, making them easier or more fun to tackle with multiple people, while missions in general are also much more fun and vary greatly this time around. Perhaps just as big of an improvement are the game's visuals. While Portable Ops saw you traverse the same bland urban environments, Peace Walker's bite-sized missions see you sneak and shoot your way through lush jungles, sandy beaches, and pretty urban environments in its 1970s imagining of Costa Rica. The stellar sound design, as well as the beautiful anime cutscenes, were carried over from Portable Ops also, meaning that the PSP stretching visuals are accompanied by outstanding voice acting and music. All of this is tied together with a much more engaging story, which sees Big Boss build up his own private militia group as he drifts further and further towards the fringes of society and lawlessness. Peace Walker also references MGS3 a lot, making it much more cohesive and relevant in the canon as a whole. While for my money, not of the same quality as some of the other entries in the series, Portable Ops is still a really great game, especially in its original handheld form, which is why it is regarded as one of the best PSP games ever made. Number 5. Metal Gear 2: Solid Snake. Much in the same way that Peace Walker improved upon every facet of Portable Ops, so too did Metal Gear 2 top the original Metal Gear in every aspect. However, while Peace Walker took Portable Ops' template and built upon it, Metal Gear 2 must be credited for developing the framework of what would become the first truly great and acclaimed and commercially successful game in the series, Metal Gear Solid. In fact, that game essentially plagiarized a large chunk of its plot, devices, and gameplay elements from Metal Gear 2. A showdown with a high-D helicopter, reading the back of the game case for a codec number, a romantic subplot, and changing the temperature of card keys are some of the many examples of Metal Gear Solid borrowing from its older predecessor. Metal Gear 2 also introduced us to some of the series' most beloved characters, including Colonel Campbell and Grey Fox, both of which returned in Metal Gear Solid. And speaking of the story, the narrative and pacing of Metal Gear 2 was vastly improved over the first game, keeping the player engaged throughout. Adding to this, and the atmosphere in general, was a much improved soundtrack, with songs like Nightfall still ranking among the most memorable in the series, even in their 8-bit form. Visually, the game is also a step up, with more colourful and detailed environments. The gameplay also evolved significantly from the first Metal Gear, and while it plays primitively relative to all entries that will come after it, it's still fun to play. With more weapons, the ability to crawl and make noise to attract the attention of enemies, and a more diverse set of environments to traverse through, this game introduced many of the fundamental mechanics that Metal Gear Solid would implement with great success 8 years later. Yes, with a tight narrative, creative gameplay, and atmosphere in spades, Metal Gear 2 is a quality game that foreshadowed the brilliance of what the series would offer us from that point onward. Indeed, the best was yet to come. Number 4, Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. Over a 10-year period between 1998 and 2008, Kojima and his crew would release a slew of exceptional Metal Gear games representative of the series creator and the studio at their creative and developmental peak. Indeed, as far as main installments in the series goes, the quality titles bearing the Metal Gear name was never less than outstanding at this time. The last of these games was Metal Gear Solid 4, and while there is a slight gulf in class between this entry and the final 3 games on this list, this is the first game that we've reached on this countdown that I would consider a genuinely outstanding video game. Guns of the Patriots set a new industry standard for presentation and gameplay innovation. Graphically as gorgeous as any other game released at the time, environments like the war-torn Middle East and the jungles of South America still look great over a decade later. Continuing a long tradition of exceptional audio design, Metal Gear Solid 4's voice acting and sound design still remains second to none in the gaming landscape. Along with all of this, MGS4 also boasts some of the best gameplay in the entire series. It introduced weapon customization, a first for the series, which allows Snake to purchase a litany of great upgrades for all his weapons, meaning that after multiple playthroughs, your arsenal is significantly larger and more powerful than during your first run through the game. The stealth aspects of MGS4 were also enhanced by an unparalleled level of design creativity and ingenuity. Snake can now hide in barrels, roll around in them, and use them to attack enemies. He can hang off ledges from a prone position, as well as switch from said prone position to a supine position without hindering movement or the player's ability to fire a weapon. He can fight alongside rebel soldiers for tactical purposes. The new Octocan camouflage changed in a chameleon-esque manner to blend Snake in with his surroundings. Boss fights, while not as inspired as those in the games we're going to discuss, were still a ton of fun and utilised the game's mechanics in different and effective ways. The detrimental quality which separates Metal Gear Solid 4 from the top 3 games on this list is its lack of cohesion in the game's pacing and the bloated nature of its story. Guns of the Patriots is divided into 5 acts, and while Acts 1, 2 and 4, set in the Middle East, South America and, minor spoiler warning, Shadow Moses Island from the original game, are among the best moments in the series, the other 2 acts are monotonous and overblown, complete with genuinely boring tailing sections and a ship gunfight that was a major letdown. The pure fact of simply having acts at all, which sees you globe hopping, disrupts the flow of the game and isn't an issue with any other game in the series, as their stories unfold more or less in real time across 1 or 2 large, continuous maps. As for the story, while it's not bad, in fact it's actually very good in places and probably better than most of the games in general, it suffers due to having dozens of loose ends to tie up from all the previous Metal Gear games. and while it does its best to do so across dozens of lengthy cutscenes, the final of which is legitimately over an hour long, it proves too much for any game, even a Metal Gear game, and overwhelms the players with plot which doesn't always reach the sky-high standards set by the series up until this point. All of that said though, Metal Gear Solid 4's story and set pieces succeed, often spectacularly, more often than they fail, and when you combine the game's high points with presentation and gameplay of this caliber, it still stands today as an exceptionally great game. Number 3. Metal Gear Solid. Even though I personally consider Metal Gear Solid 4 to be a classic, it was relatively easy to place it fourth on this list. Conversely, separating these final 3 entries was quite challenging, because aside from being 3 of the best games I've ever played, they're also, in many ways, 3 very different games with different strengths that distinguish them from other entries in the series, making them harder to rank in order from great to greatest. Metal Gear Solid was Kojima's first game for the 5th generation of consoles. Released on the PlayStation in 1998, he took full advantage of the then state-of-the-art hardware, equipping his latest installment with fully rendered 3D environments, a fantastic, fully realised musical score, and a fully voiced cast of characters. In a nutshell, Metal Gear Solid was the first fully realised vision of what Hideo Kojima merely hinted at in the first 2 games. It established all the core gameplay mechanics and presentation hallmarks that would go on to define the series. An amazing story that remains one of the best plots in the series thus far and still one of the strongest overall. Cinematic cutscenes that drive said story forward, the aforementioned voice acting, which was simply head and shoulders above anything else in gaming up until that point. This was also the first game in the series to feature genuinely great boss battles, so great in fact that they've been unmatched by any other game in the series, bar one which arguably did them slightly better, but more on that game soon. An infinitely superior rehashing of a battle with a Hind D helicopter from Metal Gear 2, and a tense fight with a mind-reading psychic that features some of the most creative use of hardware in gaming history, are just 2 examples of many encounters the player engages in, all of which take full advantage of 3D graphics and third-person combat. Okay, so every entry on this list from this point on has a gripping story, innovative gameplay, stellar sound design, and awesome boss fights. Therefore, we're going to analyse what each of the remaining games in the series does better than any of the rest. I would argue that Metal Gear Solid excels in 2 departments more than any other game in the franchise: soundtrack and atmosphere. Although most entries in the franchise have amazing soundtracks, I truly feel that MGS has the most consistently great one out of all the games. The combination of Gaelic-inspired ballads, action hero-inspired orchestration, and brooding atmospheric synth create the perfect backdrop for this tale of espionage and mystery. Speaking of atmospheric synth, lastly, we are going to talk about the atmosphere. The music which we just discussed, the story's dark undertones and its winding twists and turns, the snowy nighttime exterior of Alaskan island Shadow Moses, the cold sterility of the interior of the nuclear warhead facility, and the ever-present reverb that permeates all the dialogue, music and sound effects, all combine to create the most atmospheric game in the series and one of the most engrossing. Number 2. Metal Gear Solid 3: Snake Eater. If ranking the top 3 games in the series was challenging, then deciding which game was number 1 and which was number 2 was nigh on impossible. Damn near coming down to a coin toss, either of these 2 remaining games could, on any given day, be considered the best. Still a fan favourite today, Snake Eater was the series' first prequel, putting the player in the shoes of Big Boss in the Cold War era's Soviet Union. Along with this shift in time was a shift in overall tonality. While previous games felt more modern, taking inspiration from action flicks like Die Hard, Snake Eater looked, sounded and felt more like a classic James Bond movie, evidenced by the 007 inspired theme song and the fact that Major Zero, the game's surrogate Colonel Campbell, an important presence in the series as a whole, is, by his own admission, a die-hard Bond fanatic. Far from this being a superficial change, it's pivotal to the game's charm, allure, and makes it one of the defining games in the franchise. Another first for the series was a new emphasis on outdoor environments. Snake spends a significant majority of the game sneaking through lush jungles, forests, and swamps, again distinguishing it from previous entries in the series, which were mostly set in urban environments. This also influenced how the game is played, with an extra emphasis on survival, Metal Gear Solid 3 became the most nuanced game in the series, and saw players micromanage Snake in a way that had never been seen before or replicated since. If Snake doesn't eat for long periods of time, he gets hungry. To eat, more often than not you have to scavenge for food, either through hunting or picking wild fruit. If you get wounded in battle, players must heal his wounds, cuts and burns manually. All of these things, and more, have an effect on Snake's stamina and performance depending on whether they are treated or not. While seen as tedious to some, most fans actually enjoyed it, seeing it as adding to the overall immersion of the game. Far from being limited to food and medicine, expansion can also be felt in the game's combat. Along with a bigger and more improved arsenal of weapons, Snake Eater saw the introduction of the CQC, or Close Quarters Combat System, which gave Snake a variety of new moves as well as the ability to take hostages and interrogate enemy combatants. Which leads us to another area in which the game excels, its boss fights. Remember how I mentioned that Metal Gear Solid's fantastic bosses were second only to one other entry in the series? Well, this is it. From jungle battles with stealth-clad half-human, half-arachnid hybrids to that epic showdown in a field of blossoms, there are no other games in the series that offer up as many consistently excellent, fun and memorable encounters. The best of the lot, however, is the showdown with the End. Taking place across 3 forested areas, Snake must take out the centuries-old sniper in a pure battle of attrition. Utilising all of Snake Eater's gameplay mechanics to full effect, requiring as much mental toughness as physical. This battle, which can have a variety of different outcomes, is not only the best in the series by far, but is arguably the best boss fight in gaming history. All of this is wrapped up in what is one of the most concise stories in the franchise, and one of the best also. Significantly easier to follow than other entries in the series, this Metal Gear origin story is lighter, for the most part, on cutscene length and heavier on the charm and cinematic drama, thanks in large part to Big Boss's more charismatic, affable personality, which contrasts with Solid Snake's more stoic, world-weary persona. With its unique vibe, epic bosses, and probably the most well-paced campaign in the series, Metal Gear Solid 3 remains an absolute stone-cold classic. Number 1. Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. A controversial choice in the eyes of many, to be sure, especially over Snake Eater. However, in this man's opinion, Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty is the absolute best Metal Gear game ever made and one of the greatest video games of all time. What makes this game so vital, and just a cut above other fantastic games in the series, is harder to define than, say, Metal Gear Solid or even Snake Eater. In truth, it's a variety of different moments, gameplay features, story elements, and the overall presentation and vibe that makes this a phenomenal game that's ultimately greater than the sum of its parts. A good place to start is accessibility and replayability. While it's true that being accessible doesn't always equate to being great, it's worth noting that Sons of Liberty is the easiest game in the series to just pick up and play. A massive reason for this is how well this game still plays today. Simply put, MGS2 has aged spectacularly. In fact, I would challenge you to think of a game approaching its 20th anniversary that still looks, plays and sounds as well today as Sons of Liberty. Its futuristic soundtrack and reliably sensational voice acting give it a timeless feel in the audio department. Graphically, it still looks good today thanks to the ultra-sleek design of both the tanker and big shell missions, while the gameplay, from combat to exploration, in fact, I would argue that this game looks and feels better today than Snake Eater, a game 4 years its junior. All of this leads through the replayability. Its agelessness, coupled with the pick up and play factor and those addictive collectible dog tags, have kept me coming back to this title more than any other in the series. Getting back to the campaign itself, we start things off as Solid Snake aboard a marine tanker trying to get photographic evidence of a new Metal Gear prototype. I think I can say with some confidence that this tanker mission is probably the greatest prologue in gaming. More than a tutorial, exploring the big shell is an absolute blast. Hiding enemies in lockers, shooting it out with Olga on a stormy deck, and sneaking past a literal company of marines are highlights in an absolutely flawless opening mission. What's more, the tanker mission sets the mood for the whole game. Brilliant and tense espionage, engaging dialogue and cutscenes, and a story that is as awesome as it is batshit crazy. It serves as a perfect appetizer for what is to come. Now, much has been made of how bad of a protagonist Raiden is. Whiny, inexperienced, and clad in skin-tight rubber, fans rejected this new character, who takes over from Snake in the Big Shell chapter. However, when you look at Raiden in the context of Metal Gear Solid 2's crazy story, more on which later with as few major spoilers as possible, his presence, as well as his character traits, really do fit the narrative. Moreover, the Big Shell mission is a blast to play. Paced excellently, the player is drift-fed new plot details and mission objectives, keeping them interested and on their toes. Having to neutralise a dozen bombs around the facility is such a unique feature to this game, the completion of which leads you to your first boss fight with a rollerblading bomb disposal expert. And while the boss battles in this game aren't on par with the likes of Metal Gear Solid 3, the moments in between leading to the encounters are just as good, if not better. So, what about the story? Well, as I previously alluded to, the story in Sons of Liberty is by far the craziest and most complex in the series, and it actually takes multiple playthroughs to grasp the brunt of the narrative. While this was frustrating for some, it was extremely rewarding for die-hard fans of the series which, if you've played all the games on this list, you are most likely a part of. Dealing with things like slothfism, information control, censorship and social engineering, it demands more from the player than most other games and, when played today in these social media obsessed and ideologically divided times, is more relevant now than ever, meaning Metal Gear Solid 2 was literally years ahead of its time. Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty is the quintessential Metal Gear game. Brilliant game design, outstanding audio, silky smooth gameplay, and a winding, convoluted story that proves challenging, but not overwhelming for those willing to take the time to study it, makes this the #1 game in one of the best series in gaming, period.